That first reading from Leviticus provides for us the background in coming to a clear understanding of the passage from St. Mark that we have just heard. Among the ancient Israelites, those afflicted with leprosy, or what in a scientifically unsophisticated world was mistakenly thought to be leprosy, but could have been any common skin condition, were made to dwell, we are told, outside the camp. This refers to the encampment of the Israelites as they wandered in the desert on their way from Egypt to the freedom that awaited them in the Promised Land. To have to dwell outside the camp in the midst of the desert without the support of family or friend was as good as being sentenced to death. Furthermore, lepers were shunned, not only because their disease was thought to be contagious, but also because it was believed to be a punishment from God for their moral failings. When lepers were made to call out unclean, unclean in reference to themselves, they were in essence being forced to identify themselves with unkosher animals such as the swine. In the days of Jesus, the fate of those suspected of leprosy was obviously no better. For even though the Israelites were now very well and long settled in the Promised Land, lepers were made to live outside of the towns and villages in very deserted places. As St. Mark notes, Jesus was no stranger to those places, for it seems that he had to take refuge there in order to evade the ever-growing and ever more demanding crowds who were seeking him out. In fact, it would have been unlikely for Jesus to have encountered a leper at all unless he was frequenting those places beyond the pale of civilization. This passage reveals then that Jesus was one who dared to go where others wouldn't go, and he had the courage to allow himself to be approached by one considered unapproachable. His compassion led him to accept someone considered unacceptable. His mercy moved him to touch one labeled unclean and therefore seen as untouchable. And in so doing, he restores a man as good as dead back to life. This Jesus does out of love, asking little in return from the man, except that he would tell no one who had effected his cure. But after all that Jesus gives him, does this man obey? No. Rather, he broadcasts it everywhere, creating then a sensation that attracts even more attention to Jesus, making his life all that more difficult. As we hear these readings, on this last Sunday, before we begin the Paschal season, the phase of Lent, the context then cannot help but enhance the relevance of these readings to our very lives as well. For in some sense, we are no different than the leper. That is, in the sense that our sins render us unclean and thus would exclude us. No, not from contemporary society that may tolerate and even promote sin, but rather from the company of the saints here and hereafter. Yet Jesus, in his love and compassion, Jesus, in his mercy and forgiveness, wants to save us from that ultimate exclusion, which is final death, as he answers our pleas to be made clean and readily restores us to life in his kingdom. In turn, Jesus asks very little of us, except our respect and our obedience to him. Yet, like the leper, we are quite capable of ignoring what Jesus asks and instead doing what suits us. So once again, we are being invited to see this season of Lent not as some annual hardship, but actually as a blessing, as yet another opportunity to search deeply in our own souls in order to identify the ways in which we still prefer to do things our way, even when we know it's clearly in contradiction to his way. And then to turn to him saying, Lord, if you will it, you can make me clean, assured that out of his immense love, Jesus can only say, I do will it, and grant us his pardon. Yet let us not stop there, but do the rest of the work over 40 days, which is to try to learn anew through self-denial and through sacrifice how to say the hardest no of all, which is to ourselves and our will, in order that we might say a more authentic yes to Jesus Christ. Let us resolve to use this Lent well, so that we might anticipate arriving at Easter able to rejoice that by his grace we continue to progress in disciplining ourselves and thus sharing personally in his final victory over sin and death.